I thought the evening would pass quietly, the kind you forget by morning. Then my father cleared his throat, looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and said something that cracked open a truth I didn't know I'd been carrying. What followed was not an argument or a confession the way you expect, but a moment that rewrote how I understood him and myself. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. The evening began the way so many evenings do, quietly enough that it almost felt invisible. I was home from my apartment for the weekend, the old house still smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and the wooden cabinets warmed by years of cooking. Outside, the sky had that soft blue-gray color that settles in just before night really commits, when the birds are undecided and the streetlights hesitate to turn on. I was 22 at the time, old enough to live on my own, young enough to still feel like a guest in my childhood home. My dad stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of soup that had been simmering since late afternoon. He always cooked when he was thinking about something, though I didn't know that then. I only knew the sound of the spoon against the pot felt steady and comforting, like a metronome keeping the room calm. We talked about small things at first. My job, the traffic on the highway, the neighbor's dog that barked at nothing. It was the kind of conversation that fills space without really saying anything. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework and learned to drink coffee. The overhead light cast a soft yellow circle around us, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. My dad ate slowly, carefully, as if the soup might argue back if he rushed it. I noticed how tired he looked, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. It startled me a little, that quiet realization that he was aging while I was busy becoming someone else. Halfway through the meal, he put his spoon down, not with a clatter, but gently, like he didn't want to disturb the air. He folded his hands together and looked at them instead of at me. That's when I felt it, that small tightening in the chest that comes before something important, though you don't yet know why. He cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. I smiled automatically. "Okay," I said, trying to sound casual, though my stomach had already begun to knot. Parents always say things like that before advice you didn't ask for, or questions you're not sure how to answer. He finally looked up at me then, really looked, his eyes searching my face, as if it were a map he hadn't studied closely enough before. "Are you happy?" he asked. It shouldn't have surprised me. It was a simple question, almost ordinary. But something about the way he said it, the softness in his voice, stopped me cold. I opened my mouth to give the usual answer, the one I practiced for relatives and coworkers. "Yes, I'm fine. Yes, everything's good." But the words didn't come. In that silence, memories rushed in. Late nights staring at my ceiling, the constant pressure to prove I was doing life right, the quiet fear that I was always a step behind some invisible schedule. I realized how rarely anyone had asked me that question without an agenda. "I think so," I said finally, and even to my own ears it sounded uncertain. He nodded slowly as if he'd expected that. "I wasn't, at your age," he said. "I thought I was supposed to be. There's a difference." That was the moment the evening shifted. The air felt heavier, but not in a bad way. More like it was finally carrying weight instead of drifting. I leaned back in my chair, watching him, noticing how his hands trembled just slightly as he picked up his glass of water. "I spent a long time believing that being responsible was the same as being happy," he continued. "I did what I thought I should do. I don't regret my life, not for a second. But I regret not asking myself the question sooner." I felt my throat tighten. My father had always been solid to me, dependable, a man of routine and quiet strength. Hearing him admit uncertainty felt like watching a mountain speak. It was humbling and strangely comforting. He smiled then, a small, almost shy smile. "I don't want you to make the same mistake," he said. "I don't need you to impress me. I need you to be honest with yourself." Something in me loosened at that. The constant hum of needing approval, of measuring myself against expectations I could never quite see, grew quieter. I realized he wasn't questioning my choices. He was offering me permission. We sat there for a long time after that, the soup growing cold, the house settling around us with its familiar creaks. Outside, the streetlight flickered on, casting a pale glow through the window. I felt older and younger at the same time, like I was standing at the edge of something new, with the past gently holding my hand instead of pulling me back. That night, as I lay in my old bedroom, listening to the distant sound of my dad washing dishes, I understood that the evening had never been normal at all. It had been an opening, a quiet one, spoken softly over soup, but powerful enough to change the way I listened to my own life. That night didn't end when the lights went out. It followed me into sleep and then into the morning, lingering like a scent you can't quite place but know is important. I woke up early, earlier than I ever did when I lived there. The pale morning light slipping through the curtains and landing on the familiar cracks in the ceiling. For a moment, I was 16 again, worrying about exams and curfews. Then the weight of my father's words settled back onto my chest, gentle but insistent. I lay there listening to the house wake up, pipes knocking softly, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the radio from the kitchen. Dad always turned it on quietly in the mornings, tuned to the same station he'd listened to for years. It struck me how much comfort he found in routine, and how little I'd ever questioned whether that comfort had come at a cost. When I finally got up, I padded down the hallway in socks, passing framed photos that told a story I'd never really read closely. My parents on their wedding day, smiling with a hopeful seriousness. Me as a toddler, sitting on my dad's shoulders, my hands tangled in his hair. He looked so young in those pictures, so certain. I wondered when that certainty had first cracked. He was at the table with his coffee when I entered the kitchen, staring out the window like the view might answer something for him. He looked up and smiled, warm and familiar, but I noticed how carefully he watched me, as if gauging whether the night before had changed something. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself coffee. The mug felt heavier than usual in my hand. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the kind that used to be easy. Now it felt charged, like a held breath. I realized I was nervous, and that surprised me. I'd faced interviews and presentations without this tightness in my chest. But sitting across from my father, knowing we crossed into new territory, felt far more exposing. "I kept thinking about what you said," I admitted finally, tracing the rim of my mug with my finger. "About asking yourself the question sooner." He nodded slowly. "And I don't know how to answer it," I said, not honestly. "I don't even know what happy is supposed to feel like." He let out a quiet chuckle, not mocking, but understanding. "If you figure that out, you'll be ahead of most of us." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "When I was your age," he said, "I thought happiness was a destination. You worked hard, made the right choices, and eventually you arrived. No one told me it changes, or that sometimes it's just a moment, not a place." I looked at him, really looked, noticing the small scar on his knuckle, the way his hands wore the history of years of work I'd taken for granted. "Do you think you missed out?" I asked carefully. He considered that for a long time. "I think," he said slowly, "that I didn't give myself permission to want more. I was afraid wanting meant being ungrateful." That landed somewhere deep inside me. I felt that fear too, though I'd never named it. The guilt of wanting something different when so much was already good. The pressure to be satisfied because others might envy your position. We talked for hours after that, not in a dramatic, tearful way, but steadily, honestly. He asked me about my work, my friendships, the quiet doubts I carried. I surprised myself by answering him truthfully, even when it made my voice shake. I told him about the nights I felt like an imposter in my own life, about the constant comparison, the sense that I was running without knowing where the finish line was. He listened without interrupting, without trying to fix it. That alone felt like a gift. When I finished, he reached across the table and rested his hand over mine, a simple gesture that carried years of unspoken support. "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes you smaller," he said, "not even me." Something shifted in that moment. The idea that my father, the man I spent years trying to impress without realizing it, was releasing me from that obligation felt almost unreal. I felt lighter, and at the same time, more grounded. Later that afternoon, we went for a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot. The world going about its business unaware of the quiet reckoning happening between us. He pointed out houses, told me stories about neighbors I barely remembered. It felt like he was showing me the layers of a life I'd only seen from the inside. As we walked, I realized something else, something just as important. My father wasn't just giving me advice. He was trusting me with his own vulnerability, inviting me into a more equal space between us. That mutual respect, the recognition that we were both still learning, felt like a bridge being built where there had once been an unspoken distance. When we turned back toward the house, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I felt tired, but in a good way, like after a long, honest conversation that leaves you changed. I didn't have answers yet, but I had something better. Permission to keep asking the question, and the knowledge that I didn't have to do it alone. The next few days moved in a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. I stayed home longer than I planned, not because I had errands or obligations, but because I couldn't quite leave the space my father and I had created together. It was a strange, tender tension that hung in the house, one part comfort, one part revelation. Even in the ordinary moments, washing dishes, folding laundry, putting away groceries, I could feel the echo of our conversation shaping the air around me. One morning, I found him in his study, a place I rarely entered as a child. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, the spines faded and worn from years of handling. He was at his desk, papers spread out before him, the sunlight streaming in through the window catching on dust motes that danced lazily in the light. He looked up and smiled, but it was a different smile than usual, softer, almost introspective. "I was hoping you'd come in," he said. "I want to show you something." Curiosity piqued, I moved closer. He gestured to a stack of notebooks, each filled with neat, cramped handwriting. "These are journals I kept in my 20s, he said. "I never thought anyone would read them, but maybe it's time you see this." I felt a flutter of nerves. Reading someone else's private thoughts, especially a parent's, seemed intimate in a way that could be dangerous. But he didn't push. He simply waited, patient and steady. I picked up the top journal and flipped it open. The first page was dated when he was 21, the same age I was now, and the handwriting was tight and precise. I read the first line. "I'm scared. I'm not living the life I'm supposed to. I feel like everyone else knows something I don't." My chest tightened. These were his words, yet they mirrored my own fears perfectly. He watched me carefully as I read, saying nothing. I continued through the pages, each entry a revelation. He wrote about uncertainty, about mistakes he had made, about the long nights he spent questioning his choices. And he wrote about small triumphs, moments of unexpected joy, and realizations that shaped who he became. Reading his words, I realized he had been struggling in silence, crafting his life the best he could, all while hiding the cracks from the world. "This is why I asked you the other night if you're happy," he said quietly. "I wanted you to know that questioning, doubting, it's normal. And it doesn't make you weak. It makes you alive." I swallowed hard. It was as if the distance between us, years of unspoken understanding, had finally collapsed. I saw him, not as the infallible father I'd admired, but as a human being navigating the same turbulent waters I was now beginning to explore. And in seeing him, I began to see myself more clearly. We spent the afternoon going through the journals together. Sometimes we laughed at youthful mistakes, sometimes we were quiet, lost in reflection. Each page opened another conversation, another layer of connection. I felt my perception of him shift from a steady, stoic figure to a man of depth, complexity, and courage. Courage not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, relentless pursuit of understanding one's own heart. That evening, we sat on the back porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky was painted in soft oranges and purples, the light fading gently over the neighborhood. He handed me a cup of tea, and we sat in silence, letting the world move around us. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had shared, everything we had admitted, everything we were slowly discovering together. "I think I finally understand something," I said after a long pause. "You've been teaching me all along without really saying it. About patience, about honesty, about living with intention." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "And I'm learning from you too," he admitted. "Seeing you wrestle with these questions, I'm reminded that life isn't just about the answers we give ourselves. It's about the courage to keep asking. That night, lying in my childhood room, I felt a profound sense of connection. Not just to my father, but to the lineage of human experience, the way wisdom and vulnerability weave together, the way love manifests not only in grand declarations but in the quiet willingness to be seen and to see others. For the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of clarity, not in a loud, triumphant way, but as a gentle understanding that life's value isn't measured by perfection or certainty, but by the honesty with which we meet ourselves and each other. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew that the conversations, the moments of shared vulnerability, were only the beginning. The journey was far from over, but I wasn't afraid to continue it. The days that followed felt different, even in the mundane rhythms of home. Making breakfast, watering plants, walking through the neighborhood, every ordinary act seemed infused with a subtle significance I hadn't noticed before. I carried my father's words with me, not as a burden, but as a quiet compass. And the most surprising part was how our relationship had shifted. There was no grand epiphany, no dramatic change, only an undercurrent of mutual understanding, a bridge quietly built over years of unspoken expectation. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the living room, my father called me into the den. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the old bookshelves, and the soft tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder in the silence. He motioned for me to sit across from him, and I did, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of his attention. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice gentle, deliberate, "about what it means to live honestly, about what it means to be present in your own life, instead of just moving through it." He paused, searching my face for understanding. "I want to tell you something I've never said out loud, not even to your mother." My heart beat a little faster. I had grown used to our candid conversations, but there was a gravity in his tone that made the air itself feel heavier. "When I was younger," he continued, "I always thought I needed to be strong in the ways people expected. I pushed down doubt, fear, and even joy sometimes, because I was afraid it would make me look weak. And in doing that, I missed a lot. I missed chances to feel deeply, to connect fully, to admit when I didn't know the answer." I listened, realizing that for the first time, my father was revealing the landscape of his inner life in full, not just the lessons he had learned, but the struggles, the regrets, the moments he wished he could have approached differently. "I want you to know," he said, his eyes steadying on mine, "that it's okay to feel everything, to question, to falter. That's how we grow. That's how we understand what happiness really is, not as a destination, but as a series of moments we recognize because we're paying attention." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from a sudden, overwhelming gratitude. Gratitude for his honesty, for his courage, for the space he had created for me to see myself more clearly. For the first time, I felt fully seen by him, and it unlocked a mirror within myself that I had kept closed for far too long. We spent the rest of the evening talking, not in the cautious, measured way of prior conversations, but freely, fluidly, sharing memories, dreams, fears, and hopes. He told me stories from his own youth I had never heard, and I shared parts of myself I had long kept private. Laughter mingled with silence, and tears sometimes fell unbidden, marking the raw authenticity of our exchange. Later, as night deepened and the house settled around us with its familiar creaks and sighs, I found myself alone in my old bedroom. The moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating familiar corners that now seemed imbued with new significance. I thought about the journey of the past days, the way a single question had shifted the course of our connection, the way vulnerability had become a bridge rather than a chasm. It struck me then that personal discovery isn't always a sudden revelation. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the shared glance across a kitchen table, in the admission of doubt, in the courage to simply ask, "Are you happy?" and to let someone answer, not with judgment, but with honesty and love. I realized that my father's greatest gift to me wasn't advice, nor was it instruction. It was the permission to live authentically, to question, to feel, and to embrace the complexities of my own heart. And in that realization, I understood that happiness wasn't a fixed point, but a living, evolving presence, something we recognize in fleeting moments of clarity, in acts of connection, in the courage to be seen. Before I went to sleep that night, I spoke quietly to myself, almost a promise, to carry this understanding forward, to honor it in the choices I make, to approach life with the same honesty and openness my father had shown me. And as I drifted into dreams, I felt a profound sense of peace, a recognition that though life would continue to challenge and surprise me, I was no longer navigating it alone, nor with illusions of perfection. I was moving forward with insight, compassion, and a newfound reverence for the quiet power of truth shared between hearts. That night, the house felt warmer, not just from the heat or the lights, but from the deep, enduring presence of connection, the kind that transforms ordinary evenings into moments we carry with us for a lifetime.